Ready?
No, I'm sorry.
Time to kill the dream.
That's exactly.
No!
You give up.
Yeah, sweet. Another judge. There you are.
Inherent to Brazil has long-standing claims against U.S. cotton industry. Little A's in 2002, Brazil introduced a dispute settlement case against the United States, claiming the cotton payments violated W2 agreements. Will be W2 ruled in favor in 2004. The second argument is the U.S. is failed to adhere to the ruling. Little A is that in 2008, WTO says that they continue to violate, and the United States has tried to reform many of its programs. But Little B is that this has been insufficient. Brazil has explicitly stated that the three programs we are going to isolate are still in violation, despite the reforms. Third argument is the three programs are problematic in this sense. So the GSM 102 program, which is the program which provides loan guarantees to exporters, and Little B is the market loan program, which gives money to farmers so that they can store goods when prices are low and then flood the market when rebounds, and the tax insurance program, which provides shallow crop insulation against shallow crop losses. I will explain that on the advantage. The fourth argument is that they are all in violation. That's the plan. The U.S. federal government should adopt the stacked income protection plan. Ban the adoption of the stacked income protection plan and the extension of the market loan program to cotton. Should use the risk evaluation of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD, in determining premium rates for U.S. GSM 102 program. Is there more on the text?
No, it doesn't have port to GSM thing.
Oh, sorry. And yes, that's where it's concerned.
So is that not on there then?
No, it is. It is part of the plan itself. And should use the risk evaluation of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development in determining premium rates for US GSM 102 program. Advantage by sustainable markets. Communities current U.S. practices make African cotton industries impossible to create sustainability and successful. The first argument is tax makes competition the U.S. companies artificially competitive. The little is that U.S. is able to take advantage of downturns over months because they currently have insurance. It's called the CIP, which allows for protection against 30 to 70% of your 30 to upwards of 90% of your crop loss. The tax income protects against the first 30%, which means you're literally insulated against all forms of loss, and 80% of the premiums are paid for by taxpayers, which means it's essentially a subsidy. This allows for people to incur loss in order to shove other people out of the market, because it's not going to lead to a collapse of U.S. cotton. Second argument is GSM 102 program incentivizes crowds out countries from gaining access to new markets. It lays that incentivizes banks to give loans to U.S. exporters, and it operates at a loss of $300 million because the premium rates are too low, because the U.S. consistently assesses the risk value of emerging markets. It's actually less, which means that the U.S. markets get a lower premium rate, and it costs less for them to export. Their third argument is the MLP insulates U.S. cotton from downturns. It's the most insidious because companies are able to hold all of the crops until prices increase. The use that companies store up crops when the prices of crops are low, and then the U.S. is able to sell off the stuff with stuff which it continues to push down the prices. But it also means that only the U.S. is able to benefit from the upturn in prices. That's only temporary. The fourth argument is that Africa is specifically vulnerable. The companies don't have subsidies, which means that the ones that were crowded out first. The links plan solves one. It prevents tax from actually being implemented, and devastating job they say is empirically proven. We have been able to ban the adoption of future legislation. That is why Washington Center put it in a law that banned the future funding of research for diverting the Columbia River water. This means the tax doesn't ever go into place, and future dumping is allowed. The second argument is the plan means that African cotton has an even playing field. The farmers are going to be able to produce cotton. Farmers in Benin are able to produce cotton at 50 cents per kilogram. And U.S. farmers produce at $1.65, which $1.65 indicates that it's only subsidies that's making U.S. competitive when the premium rates are lowered, and all are even via the OECD. The one that costs less is the one who's going to get access to emerging markets. Third argument plan to get rid of the MLP. It increases accountability for where subsidy payments are going, which reforms future legislation in the United States. Starvation of 1 to 10 million people that depend on cotton production to actually pay for the fruit. The second argument of the little B is that dumping kills study. It's only the dumping in Benin cost 344,000 people to fall below the poverty line, and then over 100,000 people further died. The second argument is that this is a single impact that has 100% probability. Second argument is instability delays that American programs cost only $43 million in lost sales each year. Little B is that about a quarter of Mali's population relies on cotton farming to survive. The C is that the reason that the country can't have sustainable infrastructure because it does not have money for its government and money for its people because of structural problems with as a result of U.S. cotton farming. This leads to massive instability. There is an increase in terrorist recruitment because terrorists are able to provide the food that people aren't able to provide for themselves, and that is a direct result of the United States. This is why people are calling specifically the United States. The plan is able to solve a study found that if we got rid of U.S. subsidies, it would increase the income of every single person in Mali by $120. That means that you could put food on the table for 5 more children. It also means that you could pay for the doctors of 6 different individuals preventing disease and generally anti-U.S. incentives. This increases the propensity for nuclear strong launches against the United States. The exact thing that allowed the 9/11 attacks to happen was because there was a base within inside of Afghanistan. The same thing is affirming in Mali. If that is not prevented, then it would force U.S. retaliation in Iraq and Afghanistan, improve and increases the likelihood of Iraq and Afghanistan which killed a million people or will power on the next advantage to its WTO credibility. U.S. WTO credibility is costing out when Brazil is about to retaliate against U.S. agricultural little aid, according to a letter from the Brazilian ambassador. U.S. has made things worse because we've tried to put in the stacks program instead of other programs, and we have tried to reform the DSM web program, but that's only made things worse because the WTO has authorized the $500 million in retaliation little C's that U.S. is not compliant, which means that it really is politically impossible for Brazil not to retaliate. There was a 2012 framework that was presenting retaliation, and then we introduced the stacks program, and that may have killed the framework because they said that they made things worse, which means hardline elements are pushing for retaliation. The government does not have anything to hide behind. The second argument U.S. is going to respond. Is not going to respond with compliance delays. $500 million is dropping in the bucket a little bit. As the political elites are going to respond to that. This is unnecessary because we have tried to respond, tried to comply. This is how we have responded to little everything, and the little sees that there's no political way, there's no political will for people to respond to this. Third argument is the failure to comply destroys WTO credibility. It's absolutely unprecedented. When push comes to shove, countries have inevitably complied or they have negotiated to decrease the terms. There has never been a moment where sanctions have been disavowed, which kills credibility, and people don't trust the dispute settlement mechanism. The links plan also want to plan cuts reform programs which are at issue, which shows that the U.S. is in compliance. Second argument plan prevents Brazil from retaliating. They say they're not going to retaliate if we got rid of the implementation of stacks, which means they don't have a justification or a reason. The argument plan sends a signal that the U.S. wants to treat it's no longer going to treat itself as exceptional, which legitimizes the WTO in the eyes of people like the G20 and ensures China use the WTO as a useful organization. The internal WTO credibility is key to preventing tariff war. The little is that this empirical movement mediated tariff and sealed tariffs because they are built in WTO settlement mechanisms and bilateral trade agreement. This is increases the propensity for tariff wars for China specifically. It's empirically happened twice in history. This collapse of the economy because the U.S. massively relies on Chinese trade and China relies on U.S. exports, which collapses both the U.S. economy as the interconnected 40 countries and underpin the U.S. currency. This one leads to resource where 2 billion people live on less than $1 a day. They instantly starve. And two, when people there was a collapse of trade, that means that people have to securitize the resources, military arms, and it decreases the threshold for nuclear war because trade ties are no longer checking and resolve. This leads to extinction and industrial fires caused and they are spread around by trade winds that go out of the sun.
It's going to be 2 off, case in order. I'm just going to assume they're not please. Okay. First, going to be the bill site credibility studies. 1 year of the bill site's credibility time and status quo. This is key to the Conservation Reserve Program. The 1 years the bill site is agreed to extend the current Farm Bill to September 30th, include direct payments and other subsidies to come from. Just additionally, he's popular and supports the American Biotech and has been demanded by the National Farmers Union, American Farm Bureau Federation, and others. The majority of those. This is tenuous bill site. Continually calling on Congress to cut cotton subsidies, primarily to appease Brazilian complaints over viability of buying Brazilian farmers. The 3rd years the Conservation Reserve Program equals vulnerability because of the conservative policy expert at Dave. Now he indicated its prime target in budget negotiations. One of the few super committee suggestions to enjoy broad support last year was to cut the Conservation Reserve Program. Bill site is key to the defender because of its ability to produce the ecosystems and its carbon sequestration provision. The beast 1 year is the links. The plan devastates its credibility. The 1 year is the affirmative elimination of the cotton subsidies is one of the key provisions of the existing Farm Bill, which applies to bill site's no hosting and ability of defending that. The majority of years the plan is perceived as bill site abiding by responsibility as agricultural sector. His job is to protect the interests of the American farmer cotton industry, not universally support cotton subsidy choice to appease Brazil and eliminates the program imposed reflects poorly on him. The American years the bill act is a key player in the agricultural policy. He regulates and consults closely with Congress in crafting legislation and action to eliminate subsidies, energizing the lobby against him in the presidential progress. As the 1 year is the internal link, the Hills CRP, which is key to carbon sequestration. The Northern years you can cross-apply the argument about the chopping, blocking, and unpredictable perceived as restriction land use on bill tax energy, which is a probable target. The majority years the CRP has cotton's largest land sequestration program in the entire world. His crops keep carbon in plants. Basically, what you do is you have crops where you just plant them so it gets all of the CO2. The next argument here is the impacts from warming. The argument here is the USDA estimates that CRP sequestration has 4 million cars worth of CO2 a year. The majority here is the EOP isolates.
9 million.
Oh, 9 million, sorry. The EPA isolates that CO2 emissions per vehicle is 408 metric tons a year, releasing that accelerates the red line. The majority here is this causes extinction high, carbon, land, nitrogen concentration, decreases crop yields, and causes horrible things from happening, such as an increase in the ocean levels, which causes the impacts of the app to happen in a much faster time frame, and it causes refugees crisis, which probably increase the probability of escalating conflict. Your question?
Yes, can you summarize his thesis in this guy's name?
Vilsack is his name. He has high credibility now. You decrease his credibility. That's bad because it's key to the Conservation Reserve Program. Next is that is China textiles.
Ace one here is the China relations are stable and the cotton imports to sustain the textile industry. The warning here is the China cotton imports for 11 months of 2012 jumped 79% and increased the previous year by 406 million tons. And return years, the United States is the largest exporter of cotton on the planet with an average export market of $4.9 billion, which is subsidized $4 billion from the government. 3 years, the federal USDA increased cotton export projection to 12 billion bales based on increased demand in China's textile export market is increased to 29% next year. The 4 years in 2012, China issued cotton impound quotas to 3.9 million tons. A major textile producer in China have cotton pushing for an increase in import quotas because the strain on the domestic supply. The beast point is the plan. Devastates U.S. cotton exports, collapse in Chinese textile industry. The little 100 years, the FMLA subsidies cotton farmers under the market loan counter-cyclical program to expand the credit guarantees worth of billions of dollars and increase cotton. The majority years, the elimination of subsidies causes a decrease in supply and surge in international prices because they don't have the ability in order to isolate the market like they talk about. They're no longer protected from losses, so they don't grow as much. The number 3 years, the counter-cyclical program export credit guarantees the key price stability incentives consisting produce and export credits in order to further insulate the farmers from the market. Number 4 years, the Chinese textile industry is all dependent upon cotton imports. The demand outpaces domestic supply, and because the government has established internal prices, China cotton is 20% more expensive than the textiles caught up in Mexican WTO complaining the status quo. The cease point is the internal links. The collapse of Chinese economy. The warning years, textiles account for 40% of China's industrial output and been a quarter out of the market ever since. The return years now is a key time. China is slowly recovering from the economic downturn with manufacturing not growing at a slower pace than was expected to, and complying with volatility in the Chinese housing market ensures that the economic will decrease immediately. The third years this ripple internationally, the second largest in the world, even crossed by their arguments. The number D, that is the impacts which causes war. The war years this forces bold military adventurism in terms of Senkaku and the Spratly Islands, probably increase the escalation in tensions happening now, which probably causes war with the United States. The two arguments, those that it kills the trade, even crossed by their arguments about the likelihood of increased conflict when we can no longer trade with people. Advantage 1.
Question.
Yep. What is this WTO complaint?
Right now, China is involved in a WTO complaint over Mexicans, so it increases their cotton prices. So when you also increase cotton, it means that cotton prices go up internationally. African deforestation.
The first argument says it's impossible to compete. Now, our argument is that it would always be impossible for the African nations to compete because cotton is so land intensive. An example of this would be the C4 nations in Africa have all higher than 5% of global demand and don't have the ability in order to expand, such as Chad and Mali are examples of the C4 nations. The next argument, though, is the plan increases the cotton prices. You can crossify their arguments and the arguments made elsewhere. The next argument, though, is going to be a turn that this will increase the amount of deforestation that happens and causes drought and water conflict, which is much more conservation they talk about. The argument here is that not only UN environmental program isolate that trees draw water into the aquifer, so it pumps more water into the cycle. The number 2 argument here is that 62% is a precipitation over land because the forest pumps water into the air, so it can only increase this feedback cycle. The number 3 argument here is that this is water security is key to Africa and will only increase conflict when it happens. In particular, places like Ethiopia and Eritrea are on the borderlines. The number 4 argument here is that this will cause death, a massive amount of death, because they obviously don't have access to water, and will draw on the United States and China because of resource wars on their arguments. In particular, they say that this causes starvation, dumping, and kill sickle arguments that cotton's not going to be enough in order to fund the entire government or the individuals, especially because there's not enough land, don't have the ability to do so. They all say that $120 would be able to solve diseases, food, and help 5 more children. Argument here is that there's no way that's going to be enough money in order to do everything that says. It's much more likely that it increases water conflict that happens in much faster time frame, and they say this will cause a conflict in or U.S. retaliation. There's no reason whatsoever as to why the United States would get involved in this particular conflict, not a reason as to why it would happen on WTO credibility. First argument is that turn that this diseases. The one argument here is that WTO requires the countries join TRIPS, which is extremely conservative defense of intellectual property rights and discourages medical production. This condemns thousands of people in the developing world to die of HIV, tuberculosis, etc. Probably turns the advantage 1 in particular. The next argument, though, is going to be that this will equal spreading global production or pandemic because they take the really expensive medicine now. They can only take a little bit of it, so they develop resistance to it. That increases the amount of pandemics that are
possible. Only in a world in which we allow the cheap production of this medicine can it not only save these thousands of people alive, but also get rid of the epidemic. The next, though, is going to be a term that this entrenches poverty. The WTO has continuously supported the developed world and doesn't allow developing nations in order to have it, especially when they have key things like agricultural sector. Probably a reason as to why they wouldn't be able to do so. The next argument, though, is going to be all causes. They make arguments about this is unprecedented, which is simply not true. Little 100 years, the United States ignored a decision to end the ban on online gambling that devastated Antigua's economy, which signaled that small states don't matter in terms of the grand scheme of the WTO. The number 200 years, the EU ignored the 06 decision on GMOs in order to the United States in order to export those to Europe. Probably a reason as to why this happened before. The number 300 years, the Doha round to adjust policy to protect undeveloped nations still hasn't been concluded. That's been over 9 years, which means that they only benefit the developing world. The next, though, is that there is no impact. After the WTO original cotton decision, the United States entered into a binding bilateral negotiation with Brazil in order to have subsidies. They paid Brazil subsidies to avoid the tariffs, and that decision was supported entirely by the WTO. All of their arguments about the United States and Brazil being in conflict now over cotton are factually incorrect. The next argument says that this has empirically happened twice. I want you to extend their own argument, probably a reason as to why there is no way this would collapse the entire world economy. They also say this would draw in the United States and China. There is not a distinction or internal link that is made between why bilateral trade tariffs between the United States and Brazil would ever draw in China. There is not a distinction made coming out of the PMC.
The order is going to be the African deforestation. I call that on solvency. That's where you guys voted. But it's going to be that deforestation argument. Well, not deforestation, but actually water. Water is more like what it is. The water wars advantage on beta shoe. Thank you, sir. China textiles, and then build that credibility. It's the Taiwanese, I tell ya. You know, if our textile industry was a little better,
Let's see what they're going to do.
the this ad is China first. That might actually. Well, here we go. No, it's okay. Thank you. Thank you guys. Thank you. You guys just don't understand what talent is money.
What's the order?
The order is the deforestation, water wars, sustainable markets, WTO, China textiles, build that credibility. Ready? None of the water wars argument you are identifying unique. Number one is that there's massive water conflicts between Ethiopia and Egypt because of over damming of the Blue Nile. Number two is the war on terror is causing massive deforestation because it causes rebel groups going to those areas, which causes massive flooding that kills a bunch of ecosystem, but also causes the U.S. to dump a bunch of herbicides, which indicates that the trees are dying. That's also things like poachers are driven into the forest that collapses the ecosystem precisely because of poverty. Also other things like wheat as well as very cheap cotton. Other things like wheat are being grown in the status quo that's causing depletion of water resources. Second is no link. Cotton does not actually need that much water. I learned this in the communist elementary school education, where cotton, if you actually put too much water, the yield goes down, which indicates that they actually don't use much water. Also, in the world they get more wealth. They're going to find new water resources. Egypt's already investing a lot in desalination technology in a world where they have increased income. They obviously are going to be able to solve for this. Anything else, Sir Martin?
They say that there's never enough land.
Yeah, usually there's never enough land. Not true in a world that's not developing swaths and swaths of fertile land due to number one, there's number one rebel wars. Number two, simply because it's not economic viable, sustainable markets. Saying that there's no viable markets happening in status quo. There's 100,000 people that are dying every single year. This happening. You just say we can't fund the government. We make several arguments as why this is going to cause massive scale shifting. You say $120 is not enough. That is the initial effect. Obviously, it's going to increase from is a technology developed additionally spurs things like investment, which will spill over to the other sectors. You say that we can't fund as much. You're forgetting purchasing power parities, which means that a small amount of money goes a long way in those places, but also spillover arguments all back to this. You say that water conflicts already solved back to that extent. All of our link arguments that we're able to solve that should outweigh all of their mitigation to extend also the starvation impacts and terrorism impacts goes to extension short circuits through China textile arguments, because when there's war going on, that's probably bad.
They say no reason we get involved in
What?
another war.
No, that's the WTO argument. Isn't it?
No, it's on terrorism.
Really? Okay. You say the United States does not get drawn in because you say the United States does not get drawn. Not true in a world where they have attacks against the United States. That is an argument that we identify about anti-American sentiment. They concede in the LOC or WTO extent that WTO is failing in Central Brazil is talking about retaliation. All of our arguments are assuming the arguments about payment to Brazil, any kind of resolution of bilateral trade negotiations, because these are perceived simply as not enough. Also, they try and twice. This is also perceived as not enough, which means backlash is inevitable. We have several pressure arguments assessed that even if there's no war going on the status quo, there's not a reason why there's not going to be war in the future. You say also extend our link and internal links. You say there's alternative causes because things like online gambling. Number one, U.S. actually changed their stance. Number two, it's a very small ruling which indicates it's not something as big as a trade war between the United States and Brazil. Also, you say GMOs, but number two, these kind of these GMOs are not actually a result of dispute. Number two, these are very small disputes. It does not implicate the credibility of WTO, especially between large economies like Brazil and the United States. You say Doha, however, but Doha has been failing this question of whether or not WTO has credible conflict resolution mechanisms, not whether or not they can pass new rounds of WTO regulations. Go on to the TRIPS argument. There's no one innovating medicine in this. Innovating medicine in the status quo, and the TRIPS scheme is actually very strong, which indicates that this does not actually interact with our dispute settlement mechanism. Additionally, you say that the WTO is bad for developed nation. Not true. It does not interact also with our trade war scenario with China. Our argument is that when we can settle these kinds of disputes versus a trade war with China over rare minerals and other because China will be compliant. More China specifically pointed to the United States non-compliance with the cotton subsidies, which indicates the plan is sufficient to solve a trade war with China. It's not a question of China gets drawn in with Brazil, but China and the United States going to war independently. Anything else?
They say it happened twice, no, we can't collapse.
I have answered that. All right. China textile. First, all of the arguments are like China has a huge supply of cotton reserves. They increased 20 million bales in 2012. Also other materials, other importers are going to fill in. That's our third world argument. But additionally, Chinese textiles collapsing in status quo because of increase in wages due to the one-child policy. People are coming in. Additionally, there's government program of industrial restructuring that's trying to transfer move them to a high-tech, low-emissions economy, which means collapse or inevitable. Additionally, the new appointed banker of the central bank, People's Central Bank, was also tasked with things like dealing with the industrial restructure, which indicates that the direction of the Chinese economy is moving away from textiles. Go on to link level. First argument is current. This increases viability of textile by decreasing the amount of output cross. All of our reasons as to why the United States is artificially destroying these kind of developing markets, which means that the actual output is. Which means the actual output globally is actually artificially kept low, which means that we are able to decrease prices. But additionally, this will increase Chinese innovation and creation of other materials, like synthetic materials, which means we would actually increase stability. Additionally, the Chinese strategies try to be not dependent on imports for something as important as textiles, which indicates that they're trying to move away from the export rights. They're not dependent on imports. Going to internal links. All of the arguments are like China's economy is not collapsing. They've grown 8%, and they just revised down to 7%. Means that their economy GDP is still growing. Zero risk for any of the impacts to happen. Anything else to remember? Also, the zero risk for PLA to lash out just because their economy declines. PLA has our conventional deterrence able to check for that, and no risk of action to account. Ready? On the build act. Right. First collapse. Build-out collapse is inevitable. Number one is the new continuing resolution bill, specifically gutted Department of Agriculture. Also gutted things like the Conservation Reserve Program. Also, the fact that we've tried twice before is the reason. The fact that we've tried twice before is the reason why this guy's credibility must be low. Also, in 2012, these programs were not extended in the temporary farm bill, which indicates that his credibility should have been should not go on to the link level. Number one, it's no link. This does not just one lobbyist is not key to conservation reserve program. He might have been key to get it started, but it's not a reason why they're key to saying there are many farmers who benefit off of the conservation reserve program, which indicates that the ag lobby will be able to fill in for this. But additionally, just because we're acceding some kind of WTO proposal does not indicate that we're helping the Brazilian farmers. It's going to be perceived as us complying with WTO ruling, which indicates there's not going to be any perceived spillover. Means there's not going to be any kind of implication for its credibility. Going on its internal links. Number one is global warming is not unique just because we have CRP. Things like automobiles. That we have more than 9 million automobiles. China's also increasing the production of its coal power plants. They're building new one every single day. Also emissions coming from places like India. And Russia is simply not going to be able to solve for additional ecosystem able to adapt when the carbon dioxide increases a certain level. That would necessarily increase the amount of phytoplankton in the water in order to become a carbon sink. Also other carbon sink systems, things like the coral reefs in the Indian Ocean, as well as the Brazilian rainforest here. CRP is literally just a drop in the bucket. Any other arguments? Also global warming does not lead to extinction. People can just move inland. Also causes previous unfarmable places to be more farmable, to be more arable.
It doesn't lead to our impacts because even if global warming causes it, they don't blame the U.S. So
yeah, also does not lead to our impacts because even if global warming causes it, don't blame the United States. It also takes a long time to happen, which means you should prioritize this last.
Vilsack, the affirmative in order, China. Okay, whatever, I don't need more. Those aren't mine. I don't know what they're doing. That's gross. Okay, you're gross too.
First, you can extend the argument number 4 that there's not a link. You can also extend the entirety wall of impact defense. There's not an impact of global warming, and it's not unique. Case. Oops. First argument we want to make is that at the very least, the turn on deforestation indicates that there's absolutely not going to be solvency. The number 2 argument out, the MG indicates that the war on terror has led to widespread deforestation, which has caused massive fighting as well as herbicides. This means you would not be able to grow crops in the region, probably, and indication that you would not be able to see a development of an economy inside of Africa. More importantly, the ongoing conflict inside of Africa is an indication that increases in corporate GDP, in national GDP in those states would only be refunded to different types of conflicts. It means there's absolutely more killing. This makes poverty inevitable. There's zero chance you would be able to resolve this issue. And your next argument is no link. Cotton doesn't need water. At the very least, if there is a guaranteed inevitability of water conflicts in the status quo, then that means you would never get access to these. But the most important argument we have there is simply that the herbicides would be continuing to go on. Your argument implies that Ethiopia and Eritrea are at conflict right now. That means that there's total instability in the African economy. There's not a scenario indicating you would be able to resolve these issues. This ongoing crisis is only an indication that the conflict is inevitable, that poverty would be maintained, and that there's not a chance you solve any of this. At the very least, we would be able to slow that down, but it's not an advantage. You don't get to go for it. More upside advantage too. Your answer to the turn on TRIPS was simply that TRIPS is a very strong mechanism. That's exactly the point. The WTO is bad because TRIPS means that you can't get medication when you're incredibly poor. It protects the intellectual property rights of corporations that have incredibly expensive pharmaceutical industries, which means people can only afford very small amounts of medication. You've conceded the Warner arguments about why this builds disease immunity as you expose the disease to very small amounts of inoculation over a long period of time creates that creates a mutation that would defend against any other issue. That means that disease is inevitable. Extinction is inevitable unless we resolve this issue. Our argument is that if your argument is true that the WTO is absolutely going to collapse in the status quo, then this would be one reason to prefer, and there's not a unique impact to the collapse of the WTO in terms of a trade conflict, because that's always going to happen. Furthermore, if your defensive arguments are true that China would not necessarily lash out into the countries because of a tanking of the economy, then we are going to be ahead on that condition. You can also extend the number 2 argument out of the LOC that you would simply entrench poverty because of the way that the WTO is constructed. The third argument out of the all cause and indications to why this is true. Our argument is the Doha round has been concluded after almost a decade, probably an indication that large countries are not willing to give their sovereignty up to the WTO in the interest of poor countries. And you say that Antigua is nonsense because the United States reversed its decision. That is just not true. This probably means it's going to happen. There's not a unique advantage to the affirmative. Even if this impact is assessed by both sides, we will still win the unique time frame differential to the China scenario. And you can extend the number 4 argument, which is that no impact to the U.S. has a binding bilateral negotiation to pay Brazil. Okay. China. As an overview of this position. The problem you're going to run onto on China is one of time frame. You are making arguments as to why China is going to be transitioning away from the textile industry over the long term, but that does not implicate their dependency on it in the status quo. This is the uniqueness block that you have functionally conceded. It suggests that 40% of their export market means it's absolutely devastating when cotton spikes occur over the short term, and then we see the inability to make that transition and almost a guarantee of adventurism, particularly if your arguments about trade are true. One of two things has to be the case here. Either collapse of trade doesn't cause war, in which case there's not an impact to the AF, or collapse of trade does cause war, and we assess that impact over a shorter time frame than you would be able to. Also, the disadvantage turns the affirmative, I think, for pretty obvious reasons. Line by line. First, your argument is that China has a huge amount of resources. They have over 20 million bales of cotton in reserve right now, but you don't have any. But unfortunately, in the last month, China has begun to release their strategic reserve cotton primarily because of the strain that has been put on the cotton market domestically. Let's talk very specifically about how the cotton import-export and then the textile production market works in China. There are basically three very large firms that are allowed to export textiles, and those are also the only firms in China that are allowed to import their cotton. The rest of the cotton in China is earmarked for domestic use and for domestic sale. That's why it is the case that China is the largest producer of cotton in the world, which is in our uniqueness arguments, but it is also the largest net importer of cotton in the world because of its dependence for the export market. You would dismantle that. That's also an indication that that cotton has been earmarked for domestic production rather than for export production, means that you would still lose a massive amount of receipts for the Chinese economy and the way that it would continue to develop. Your next argument is the second argument you make is that an increase in wages means that it's inevitably going to collapse. Look, our argument is that that's not implicated in the short term, which is true of all the uniqueness arguments. You're suggesting they're making a turn to non-manufacturing, transition to non-manufacturing based industries, but there's not a reason that would happen. Your three argument is that that means it's inevitably going to collapse because of the transition to those industries, but there is a difference between a transition and a collapse. The Politburo, the CCP, and the other entities in the Chinese government would have constructed a plan that would move you away from cotton very slowly, but what happens in the world of the affirmative is that cotton prices shoot up so rapidly because of the collapse of the American export market that there's nowhere for any of that to happen. That is why the economy would collapse. It's a unique situation. Your next argument is that they have controlled, that the banks have created a restriction, they're moving away. Once again, that's not implicating any of our time frame arguments. Your eight is, this would be increasing.
It says that the output is artificially low.
Yeah,
our uniqueness that the USDA has increased export.
Yeah, they say output is artificially low right now. That is not responsive to the uniqueness, particularly the argument saying that the USDA is propping up the United States export market, which is also an argument assumed by the affirmative. But the other argument, which is that the number one uniqueness, that the Chinese production jumped 79% over the last year. They're putting out 406 million tons, indicating that we are trending upward, even if there's a long-term transition coming now. Your next argument is turn that you would increase innovation. That is irrelevant. It's impossible to create innovative products in China when there's a collapse of the GDP. That makes it irrelevant. It means they're probably locked into dirty manufacturing industry, which make global warming probably more accessible. And you can extend the link arguments to come out of the LOC that you would absolutely collapse the export guarantees, means that the prices skyrocket. If the prices skyrocket, which you don't have defense to, in terms of you don't have defense to the increased prices of this cotton, then we are ahead. Your next argument is that China simply wants to stay ahead, that they're transitioning away, but you have conceded the argument that it is a question of the export market. You can cross-apply the specific arguments we make about the divisions of the Chinese textile economy at the top level of this disadvantage. Your next argument is simply that we're wrong, that there's not an economic collapse right now. Thank you for reading uniqueness arguments to Chinese economic collapse. This only means that there is a recovery, but that it is slow, which jives with the internal link arguments we make, saying that China is recovering from a collapse of the housing industry and issues connected to the growth of the middle class. This means that we have uniqueness for this scenario. There is not a meaningful bit of link comparison, if only because it's a question of what happens over the short term. This kind of initial shock to the Chinese economy would be absolutely devastating over that time frame. Your last argument is simply that there's no risk of a conflict. We wouldn't lash out for resources over the Sakakus or Dayu. I think there's a reasonably high risk of this, particularly given the analysis suggests that the impact to the AF either is true or isn't true. If China has to jumpstart its economy, it does what countries always do when they see massive economic collapse and they have no way out. It's a transition to a wartime economy, increases manufacturing, probably means you can't resolve any of your transition arguments. At the very least, it will create widespread poverty in China, create a scenario where there would be some amount of lashing out as they attempt to access those resources, and collapse trade interdependence. Time frame matters in this debate. We are basically racing to the same impact. I think we are unequivocally winning arguments saying that collapse happens immediately as a result of the affirmative. Time frame matters, first of all, because it's nice to live a little bit longer, I suppose, but more importantly, because it jacks the uniqueness for every other impact in the debate. If this collapse happens now, it problematizes the scenario for literally everything else that would come in the debate, which is why it should be prioritized. We are ahead on both time frame and probability in this debate, and we have a turn to the affirmative. No way out for Whitman.
It's going to be add 1, add 2, then textiles. Everybody good? Okay. Look, on advantage 1, we are extending his defensive claims, which are devastating to their agricultural policies. They say that terrorism is increasing now, which causes U.S. to cause deforestation and drop herbicides so they can't grow anything and kills all the agricultural, including the ecosystem. That's probably devastating because if we're dropping a ton of herbicides, it probably means that they can't grow cotton. But more in particular, I think that we also have a chance of a turn here, that at the very least, this would only increase the probability of deforestation, which would be devastating because it would cause water wars in the region. But even if that's not true, the answers to the water wars are that they're happening now and are inevitable. It probably means that there's not any good reason as to why the plan text would try to save the African economies if they're already going to be in a wartime scenario. Go to the WTO. They are conceding the specific defense to the U.S.-Brazil trade war scenario. This is devastating. Extend the argument that I'm making out of the LOC and Ben makes. I think it's the number 4 on the block, which is talking about how the United States has paid Brazil's subsidies and the WTO has approved this decision, which probably means that there's no chance of a U.S.-Brazil trade war from happening. The only chance is that this term, which applies to the WTO in large, goes through and causes a global pandemic. I think that if you don't want to evaluate either the China disad or the advantage, this is the easiest way out of the debate. He has conceded that this causes a global pandemic in the short term and causes extinction. At the very least, there is defense everywhere else in the debate. There is not a single defensive claim on this argument. It probably means that it goes in our way. The literally only arguments are there's no innovative medicine now and it doesn't interact with us. Our argument is that the medicine exists now, they just don't have access to it, which means that even if you give them 100% access to this claim, we are still leading to a 100% pandemic. You can vote on that. But go to the Chinese textiles. The thing that I want you to keep in mind here is what Ben highlighted in the MO is time frame, but aside from that, the specificity of our arguments. He is talking about a long-term transition away from cotton, not what the actual market situation is like currently. You can extend that this is 40% of China's industrial output, as well as our arguments about the exportation projection that is happening. That's from the USDA that will increase it by 12 million bales. It probably means that China is expecting this to increase and is important for their economy. The terms here make no sense, that it's artificially kept low. Their own argument about advantage 1 is that we engage in massive amounts of dumping, which probably means that we're selling it, and it is cheaper, which is our entire argument. That even if their argument is correct that it's kept out of the market short term, it's still cheap in the long term, so China can have access to it. The synthetic materials turn is also something that is probably not very probable. There is not an explanation other than they can transition to synthetics, which is not happening in the SQO and would take a very long time, which still means that they would collapse in the short term. You can extend the impacts now. He is winning arguments possibly that the PLA would not backlash, but he is not winning any of the arguments about how Japan would lash out and try to grab resources because it's viewed as Chinese weakness. These arguments are conceded. Moreover, all of the advantages that they would go for would be these same impacts. If the entire global economy collapsed, it probably means that the African economy is not going to be doing so hot, and there's no chance that they would be able to solve for that. At the end of the day, I think you can vote on the WTO turn that this would cause the pandemics to happen, as well as the defensive claims that they are making on both advantages, plus the fact that the specificity and time frame of the Chinese disad outweighs anything of the advantages.
Is going to be advantage 2, China, and then finally, sorry, advantage 2, China, advantage 1. Ready? We have a larger internal link into extinction because it's not just the collapse of 40% of China's exports, but 100% of them, and all of the U.S. exports. That is the result of a tariff war, which means we have the higher chance of economic collapse leading to extinction. They will not access sufficient internal link, especially because of our defense that they are mishandling on the top of the China flow now. And the probability China breaker was advantage when there was guaranteed starvation that we are able to solve now. But a WTO credibility, they try to explode this super broad argument and an extinction level claim. One, they have conceded the trade scheme is too small to actually cause the link. Second argument that there was no innovation in the status quo in these countries, which means that it would be impossible for them to solve for a pandemic, which means it's not unique. Often, third argument that they do not read an extinction. In fact, I get we answer now. The U.S. and China quarantine measures would be able to check. They've gotten better since the bird flu and bird flu blues. There was no impact to extinction. They never quantify how many people would be killed in a pandemic. The last bird flu killed 30 frickin' people, and there was double mind either it kills the host too fast with such a high rate, or it can spread, or it doesn't actually cause extinction, and or it doesn't cause extinction just because they say the word pandemic does not mean everyone in the world dies. They say it entrenches poverty. They don't explain the mechanism through which the WTO entrenches poverty. Do not assess this terminal defense, especially when there are measures within the WTO that literally protect developing countries, specifically, and concede that China and other developing countries are going to be in compliance with the global plan, which means we solve back the way in which WTO entrenches. They say the Doha round takes the unique is conceded. For Sean's writing, that's a question of WTO credibility and dispute settlement mechanisms, not whether they are able to pass new regulations in the future, which means this does not interact with their internal link, whether China uses this credibility. You say it's not unique because of Chattanooga. This is extending through conceded that this is too small. Brazil is the third or fourth largest economy sixth largest economy in the world. Chattanooga, I can't even freaking point on a map. There's a reason why it doesn't indicate U.S. credibility. You say U.S. finding bilateral negotiations to pay Brazil solves the uniqueness question. You have conceded Sean's argument that our uniqueness assumes this, even if we have negotiated with to pay them. This was in 2012, and then we said we were going to pass the tax insurance program, which would devastate both their agricultural industry and all of them within Africa, which is why they said, quote, the things have gotten so much worse. That's why they were going to punish us, and the U.S. is not going to comply. Causes China's not going to collapse. They don't go for any of that defense, and we will outframe on the internal link now that are China's relations. One extent, the analysis that they have literally 20 million
increase there.
barrels of cotton banked, and they have increased their supply. They say they are already cutting into it. I don't think this is true, and even if their analysis that they use 12 million per year, which means they're going to be able to tie themselves over for 2 years. This is long enough for the developing world to fill in the gap, because we are straight winning the link turn now on the question of dependency. This means that they would also have a sufficient of time, because they would have at least 2 years or more to make a transition away. And yeah,
They've increased their reserve by 20 million. They have way more than just.
Yeah, they have increased their reserve by 20 million, not actually decreases, which means they have way more they can insulate themselves for later the years to come, and the fact that they have massive reserves is the reason why the time frame distinction made by the AMO, which is the only freaking argument he goes for, is not actually fast, because they would be able to tie them over for sufficiently. And I'll go to the link question now. We gut check this link argument because this link is contingent upon prices, and then their word is that China is at a uniquely vulnerable spot. That's not a reason why the textile industry is in a uniquely vulnerable place, and minor increase in prices as a result of the plan is not sufficient magnitude to actually cause economic collapse. Second, they have conceded that this just means that there were going to be developing markets and other economies going to be able to increase output, because it is kept artificially low, which means prices are not going to increase because supply is actually going to freaking increase. This is the way it works. Tax creates dumping, which means our prices are kept, which means it collapses African countries from actually ever getting off the ground. It prevents them from going and getting to fertile lands, which you've conceded actually do exist on the advantage one, which means that they develop these fertile lands. It increases output. Prices don't increase. There was not a sufficient ammo response, and this at least causing the question of the magnitude of the link. And when we have the internal case being only 40%, this is a reason why it does not trip you. Mishandle Sean's growth analysis. They have grown 8% of their economy, which is why a 40% decrease in exports, which it wouldn't be a total collapse of the entire sector if there was a tiny price increase, especially given our link argument. You will increase maybe a fraction of 40% of their exports. That is not even close to the chance of tip or trade war, which means that 0% of the trade between the U.S. and China is going to happen. That's a far larger internally, far larger probability, and makes time frame larger relevant. The tip or trade war would happen immediately, and the retaliation is about to show, which means that you should vote on the fact that extinction is freaking inevitable. Means it's tried after the affirmative. Any probabilities how you should evaluate it. We're literally all going to die down. Go to advantage when sustainable markets. I need to win the link argument is that there is sufficient region within Africa. They try to go for these non-unique arguments. Too bad you've conceded that. Sean's second level analysis, which is that there's no link. Water is irrelevant to cotton because it does not use a large amount of water. This is what he learned in his communist schools in China, and which is not offensive because he already admitted that. Which means that even if there was a slight decrease in water, that's not a reason why the cotton industry is going to collapse. Second, conceded that there was no reason why that these non-uniques are all solved by the impact of our affirmative. We resolve instability. We resolve these impacts, which means people are able to go into new regions that decreases the link magnitude, and you have a guaranteed 10 million people are going to die as a result of not having having cotton, 100% probability only risk is all.
Cool. Congrats, you guys, for being here. This was an bracket, right?
Yes.
Good job. It's a 2-1 for Mckendree.
All right, well, I sat, so I'll go first. This is a really hard round for me to decide. I like your strategy, Mckendree, and I think you're executing it very well. I like the way you debate. But it comes down to being really, really hard for me to evaluate a couple of critical issues. So first I go to advantage one. I think you're winning pretty terminal defense. I think all of your answers about why herbicides being sprayed to get out of to get out of this deforestation term and to get out of the war on terror or whatever, all those are pretty damning arguments about how there will be no risk of cotton production. So I think that there's very little risk that African cotton production can happen. So I think that this means no one picks up the slack. There's nothing here. No risk of offense here for y'all. I don't think there's similarly a risk of deforestation because that seems to be happening now. So I don't think there's a risk of that. So then I have to go to WTO credibility. So WTO credibility is hard for me to resolve because the impact of the 1AC is not particularly clear to me. I do not understand where these bilateral trade wars are going to occur. There is no real discussion in the PMR of here's a scenario of bilateral trade wars that are going to occur. There is a discussion at one point in the MG of Chinese rare earth minerals, which possibly has some traction. I understand that there could be something there. But you're flagging this as a whole bunch of countries are going to have to get into these trade wars with the United States, and that WTO credibility over the negotiations portion is the critical component. So, moving to the negative arguments, I do not think you are answering this argument about WTO diseases and TRIPS particularly well. However, the way I have this argument flagged in the 1NC is that this would kill thousands of people and it would be a global pandemic. I do not have it being flagged as killing millions of people or really any explanation. And I have a little bit of trouble giving more impact magnitude to that. I guess I'm just not willing to do that. So I think you are running a risk, an unmitigated risk of a global pandemic that kills thousands of people, maybe a whole bunch more. But that's it. I think your extinction claims are new, and I think his answers are sufficient to why this would not go to extinction. So at the end, then I have to evaluate this question of whether or not what's occurring in the status quo means that this scenario is not unique. My heart-of-heart feeling is that you are absolutely correct, that the scenario is not unique. It's being resolved now. I do not think the arguments that are extended on the flow are sufficient to do that. I think the app is winning, the fact that their app functionally postdates your argument about praying Brazil subsidies. I don't even think that's really ultimately relevant because it's not contextualized in the broader context of the United States will make these agreements with every other nation. And so that means that ultimately I think there is some risk, although it would be nebulous, of these trade wars happening or these coming trade tariff bilateral wars. So I don't totally know what the impact is, but I mean the impact of the economy, but I don't know totally what the magnitude is, but I think there's some magnitude there. So then I have to go to the disset. The disset is very hard for me to evaluate, and this is where I struggle because there's no impact comparison between this really, or there's no impact comparison that's able to resolve this versus the advantage one. I think you are running a significant risk that China is working right now. It is absolutely totally dependent on the United States production. I think that the plan would collapse United States production. So I think you're winning that link argument. The thing that gets me into trouble is I do not understand how to evaluate this argument that China has reserves now of 20 million bales or whatever you measure cotton in. They have that much cotton now. Your answer to this argument is that they are releasing their strategic reserve. They started that because they're already pressured, and then a discussion of the three big cotton importer-exporters and how it's domestically earmarked. I don't have a figure, and I have searched my flow for a long time looking for a figure indicating how much China consumes of cotton per year. I remember a figure of like 470 million from the LOC, but I did not have that down, and the affirmative is making this claim that there's 12 million bales maintained a year. I don't know where that argument comes from either, so it's really hard for me to evaluate how much the strategic reserve actually matters. The reason the strategic reserve is so important to my decision is because the question of whether or not a transition gets hijacked seems very, very dependent on whether or not China has enough that they can just release to their market, and so I am ultimately deciding that it seems like that the idea of this transition is I'm siding with the affirmative. I think the transition that's coming now, they can stave off the transition being too bad by slowly releasing this strategic reserve, and that can get them by for a while. And that link outweighs the link of the immediate price spike, because it seems like all of your links are the immediate price spike, and that totally makes sense to me. I just don't know how to deal with this reserve argument. So I ultimately think that the transition in the Chinese economy will not be particularly bad, and that the advantage one outweighs the magnitude. The only thing I would say is I think the LOR could win this round for me, for you all, pretty easily by being more specific on the areas that they're going for, right? Like, I think you're ahead in this debate, but the LOR, like, I feel like you need to close doors rather than allow me to have to make this decision, because, like, if you had gone to this subsidy, or had gone to this 20 million reserve argument and been more clear on, like, here's what it said in the LOC, and here's what happens, I think you would win this debate. As it is, I think the PMAR does a really good job on this disadvantage. It's a very, very close thing, and I very much see why I sat. So, yeah, if you all have questions.
I think it's pretty well solidified everything you said. I agree with every single thing that you just said, except for I assessed that last argument in the opposite direction. I think that if the cotton is earmarked, that they might not have enough cotton to continue to export as much as they need to, and that would trigger the impact of the disadvantage. That is a maybe sooner and also better link argument than it is link defense. So I assess that argument the opposite direction. Every bit of the rest of it down to the T, exactly the same, including the size of the impact of the TRIPS argument, even though I personally am terrified of tuberculosis and people not taking the fullness of their tuberculosis medicine, which I think is caused by this, but you're not nearly that. Like, that is the disease that mutates when you only take half of your medicine and is expensive because of TRIPS. Yeah, so I would agree with all those things. So here's what I have in terms of numbers. I had 12 million as the expected increase in exports or something like that, which then puts the 20 million, even if it is an increased number, in somewhat of a different light. And so that's part of the reason I'm willing to go there. And then on WTO credibility, the reason that I think this has a low risk of an impact, besides me, like, I'm being a little bit confused about the scenario. In the MO, I have the Doha argument. It's a different framing from the LO argument, but in the MO, the Doha framing is that this, even though this is about making future regulations, it's indicative of the fact that developed nations are not willing to give up any sovereignty on trade issues to the WTO, which then problematizes WTO solving anything like that. So that's all I'll add. And yeah.
Fine. Just a question of framing for try or die for you guys. How would you like better impact framing? Because for me, it seems bold to go for extinction is inevitable, and they have the same internal link into our impact, and that their internal link is guaranteed larger because the MO is not contesting that there's going to be a trade war between the United States and China, which totally shuts off trade, and then just be like blanketly assert that, or not sure, it's in the debate, but like assert time frame, we win.
So I might extend cotton reserves and like some mitigation on cotton. You don't have any offense on cotton as far as I can tell.
We have the term that we phrased as a term, which was that it increases production from other.
Right. So go for defense there, and then explain. Right. You're right. There's relatively less argument against your internal link scenario, but I think there's not a lot of MG discussion of your internal links or impacts on WTO credibility either. So if you sit down on that, I think you absolutely have a way just to be like, yeah.
I just thought that it would
I'm a small PMR person, so.
I think you need to explain it basically a lot like the way that Will understood what would happen with the cotton reserve. That every bit of the effect that they'll feel in the short term, they'll slough it off bit by bit out of their cotton reserve, and then you need to go another level into that. Like, for me, this concept of it being earmarked is, since it's not really debated, is a very it's as strong an earmark as possible until you have an answer to it. So you need the argument at some point, no, they'll sabotage their domestic textile production in order to continue to export if exporting is where the money is at. And that argument would increase the quality of the link turn, or would be able to stave off the disaster long enough to get to the link turn, I suppose, to be the exact way that it would occur.
Let me just add one thing on that. The reason that, yeah, I looked at the earmark argument for a long time, and the earmark argument, I was just unclear enough as to what the earmark meant vis-a-vis import or export. So that's another place that the LOR had been like, look, because I understood the earmark as being for domestic consumption, so that meant that I thought that domestic consumption was manufacturing textiles and sending them out. So that's
Yeah,
why
there were
I'm-
two levels that maybe were too fast in the MO.
Well, yeah,
It's
but that's-
domestic production for domestic sale.
Right, so that's how we.
Yeah, so, yeah, this is where the LOR.
Cool.
Yeah.
Great debate, guys. One of those ones at home.
Thank you. Good luck, guys.
Did you have a question? Ian? Okay.
Not in Glasgow.